Welcome to MacGyver's Workshop, where you never know what we're going to be working on next. If you're not too careful, you just might learn something.
Well, hi there, and welcome to MacGyver's Workshop, where you never know what we're going to be working on next, and if you're not too careful, you just might learn something. Subaru makes a tool for getting the pistons out of these motors. It's like $400 or $500, but there's actually a way to do it without having to invest in that tool. You just need a piece of thin metal rod like this, and just a little soft plastic mallet or rubber mallet. You don't want to go framming on it. There's access ports on the front and the back of the motor, and you just kind of line the piston up and pull the snap ring out and drive the wrist pin out. All right, I've taken the block off the engine stand and put it on the bench here, and I've taken the liberty of cracking everything loose so I can blow through here and zip everything off rather quickly. The first thing we're going to want to do before we crack the case open is get the pistons out. Now, to do that, what you're going to need as far as special tools is you're going to need a 14 millimeter hex socket to get this plug and this plug out. And then you're going to need an impact driver with a Phillips bit to get these guys out right here. And you're probably going to need a pair of nice long nose, needle nose pliers. Probably not going to need them this long, but these are the ones that I have. I got a bent tip and I got a straight tip. And don't try to do this with a ratchet or a screwdriver. It just ain't going to work. You're just going to round the screw out, and you're going to be mad. There we go. May take a couple of whacks to get it, but you'll get it. And of course, you always run the risk of breaking the tip off of your Phillips head bit there. Gotta hate it when that happens, because then you gotta go digging it out of the Phillips head screw and hope that you can get it out. I reckon that's the difference between a cheap impact driver, ergo Harbor Freight, that sort of thing, or a good one. So that's going to slow me down a little bit. I'm going to have to dig that out of there. And we'll be right back. All right. Well, I got her out of there. Whew. Well, it's just like one nightmare or potential nightmare after another. You always have to approach every bolt with the understanding that it can ruin your day. And in many cases, that's what happens. I mean, you saw me get lucky a few times on this motor, but it doesn't always happen that way. All right, now this one here is sealed with looks like an anaerobic sealant. And you can see the plug in there. Now, that's one that I haven't loosened yet. So we will go ahead and pop that puppy open. Fortunately, none of them have been terribly tight, so that's a good thing. As I turn the crankshaft over, you will actually see the piston and the rod moving up and down there. And when you go to pull this piston pin out, you'll line this up with the hole right there, and then you'll reach in there and pop that snap ring. And that's how we'll get that piston pin out. So I got my little camera here on the bench. Squeeze that pin together, or that clip, I'm sorry. Kind of a snap clip. And it popped out. But it's down there where we can get to it. That's no problem. And we go through the other side. Okay. And you have to move the rod out of the way a bit, just enough to where you can get in there and get out of the way of that rod. And you have to avoid the clip on the other side of the piston as well, because you know there's a clip on both sides. And just very gently tap that wrist pin out of there. Compared to a $400 some odd tool, I'll take this any day of the week. Now that we've got our wrist pin driven out, and we'll shift over to the other camera here. You just want to rotate the piston 90 degrees. And you know, that can be a bit of a challenge. If I can get a grip on it here. It might give you a little bit of fuss there. There we go. That should be enough. Let's see what happens. Ideally, it should pop the piston out just enough where you can get your hand on it. There's a lot of carbon on that piston. Got it stuck in there pretty tight, but once you get it past a certain little bit, then she'll come on out. And there you go. There's your piston. And you can see there's a good bit of scuffing on that piston there. So now we'll go ahead and go through and pop all the rest of these pistons out and be $400 richer. Now it's time to pull all our bolts out. Well, make sure you don't forget this little bolt down in here. It's a little wee bitty 10 millimeter. There she goes. And we'll stand her up. And we'll pull our crankcase off of there. And we'll pull our crank out, and we'll get a look and see what our bearings look like too. Get our main out of there. I'm going to keep these in place here so I know where they go. And yep, had this thing have started, she'd have been mighty noisy looking at these bearings. All right, let's get this crank over here on something soft. I'm gonna clean this bearing off, and then you can see what kind of condition it's in, which isn't very pretty. Yeah, I don't know how well you can see that if this thing focuses, but I'll take a picture of it with my phone. And yeah, the bearings are pretty galled up. Now we're going to measure the cylinder bores and get some numbers, as it's always important that before you send your motor off to the machine shop that you kind of have an idea of what to expect. Now, the numbers are always going to be different because they're using different tools, and chances are their tools are going to be better than the ones that we have, but at least you get an idea and know where you're at before you take the motor in. You can tell by looking at this flat on the passenger side of the block. If it's the original motor, it will have the VIN number stamped into the block, and you can match that with the VIN number on the car and tell if it's the original motor. So, and I'll post some pictures here. Now, the other thing is when you are measuring your cylinder bores, Subaru has two specifications on this motor, and there's an A and a B, and one is slightly larger than the other. And you can tell on the top of the two halves of the engine block, and this being the front of the engine, there'll be a little flat on the top, and you'll probably have to clean it off. You'll see that there's like an AB, and in this case it's an AB but opposite. And what that is that tells you the specification for each cylinder on that side of the motor. So that means when we measure the front cylinder on this side, we need to check it against spec A, and the back one, we check it against spec B. And the same thing here. Now this one has a spec B on the front and a spec A in the back, which is opposite the other side. And when you look at the spec sheet for this motor, you'll see the difference. It's not a lot, but it's enough to make sure that you set your gauge right when you're measuring that individual bore. To check our cylinder bores, we're going to use a dial bore gauge. I'll set my dial bore gauge up with the appropriate anvil. I'm using a 3.8 with a 0.12 shim. And that gets me right where I need to be, and I can have be about in the middle of the travel on my my gauge here. Then what we need to do is I've set my caliper here up. Of course, I checked the calibration on it first to make sure it was accurate. And then I set this up to be roughly in the middle of the B spec, because I'm going to do a B hole first here. And then you take your gauge and zero it at that measurement. And then when we measure the bore size, we will take and add or subtract, you know, whether we're bigger or smaller than that specification. And you want to make sure you clean the cylinder bore out really good, you know, get any schmutz or, you know, spooge out of there. We need to measure the cylinder bores in a very specific way. You basically have like a thrust side and a non-thrust side. That has to do with the way the crankshaft rotates, the direction of rotation, and all that, to where it's going to load the piston harder against one side of the cylinder than the other, and that's where you end up with out of round or taper. And then, of course, with wear is just the overall general diameter. What we want to do is we want to take 3 measurements this way, front to back, and we'll take those measurements at the relatively close to the top of the bore, just under the ridge. Then we'll take one in the middle, and then we'll take a measurement down at the bottom. And we'll record all those measurements, and then we'll take another 3 measurements 90 degrees from that vertically, and go top, middle, and bottom. And now vertically in this case, at the top, looks like we have most of our scoring. So we are scratches, and we should see some significant variations there. So what I'm going to do is I've gone ahead and just kind of made me a little sheet here. You know, we got a little Mikey CAD drawing here. Looking at the front of the motor, the cylinder's numbered, so you have 1, 2, 3, and 4. And I have a little chart here to where we're front to back, top, middle, bottom, and then top to bottom, top, middle, bottom. And we will have a little spot to write all those little measurements in there. And by comparing those against the specification, we know how far in or out we are as far as, you know, how bad the cylinders are worn. So I get my pen at the ready here, and what we want to do is we want to make sure that we have our gauge, you know, straight in the bore, so we're getting an accurate measurement. So anything clockwise of 0 is going to be smaller in dimension, and anything to this side of 0 will be larger. So what we want to do is we want to take our tool and see right where it dwells at the smallest measurement there. So we're doing the top of the bore, front to back, and we're at roughly 2 thousandths. So since we're this side of the 0, we have to subtract 2. So technically, as ugly as that bore looks, it's still within the factory spec, because the diameter is all less than 3.9175. However, we have to clean all these scratches out of this bore by honing it. And chances are that's going to take it beyond the maximum spec because it's pretty close. I'll get these rest of these cylinders measured, and I'll pop up my little chart here with a little summary of where we're at. Now we will measure our outside journal diameter on the crankshaft. We'll do that for the main bearings and for the rod bearings. According to our spec sheet, which we'll pull off of All Data or Mitchell 1, whichever you have, or your Haynes manual, it will list a minimum and a maximum diameter. Now, All Data here calls it crank pin outer diameter and crank journal outer diameter. So, to do that, we will use a micrometer. Now, I don't have any fancy ones. These are just Harbor Freight, but they are reasonably accurate. And that's really all we're going for here. We want to know whereabouts our wear is on this crankshaft. The machine shop's going to come up with their own numbers when they check it anyway. But for the sake of the video here, I'll show you how you do this. Now, first thing we want to do is we'll want to zero our micrometer. Now, how we do that is depending on which size micrometer you're using. In this case, we're using a 2 to 3 inch. So your micrometer kit will come with a standard, and you'll use a 2-inch standard for the 2 to 3 inch micrometer. Run this down on that standard until it clicks. And your micrometer should, in theory, read right at 2 inches and be zeroed, meaning that the micrometer will read 2.000. You should be able to see that it's sitting right at 0. Now that we know that our micrometer is zeroed properly, then we'll start taking our readings. Now I'll just use this first crank journal here as an example, but then I'm going to have to do all the rest of them. We will take, in this case, we'll take 2 measurements, and we'll get a diameter here. I'll do there are 2 measurements 90 degrees apart. And once we're there, we'll lock it, and then we'll read our micrometer. You'll read first the barrel here, and it's at 3, and then 2 little tick marks that are 25 thousandths each. So what that would mean is we have 2 inches, 350 thousandths. So we write that down. Then we read the thimble, and this one is reading 12, because you read whatever is below this line. So we've got 10, 11, and 12. And we write that down below our 2.350. And since this one reads out to a tenth or 10th of a thousandth, then we'll read this extra little scale here. And what we want to do is we want to pick the number that is lined up with the A line on the thimble. And you disregard any of the numbers on the thimble. We just read whatever this number is here. And I have to use a magnifier because I'm old and blind. But in this case, we're lined up on 3. So, and put that below our other measurement, and then we add them all up. See where that is in regards to whatever the specification for this outside diameter is. And you get that from your manual, of course. Then you want to take another measurement 90 degrees from that. So since we did the first one like this, we'll do our next one like this. Now, ideally, if you were wanting to measure for taper and all that, then you would do that, 2 readings 90 degrees apart on each side of the bearing. And then that would give you any taper as well as your outside diameter. And then same process, we read the barrel here, then the thimble, and then the vernier, and add them all up and come up with your number. Now, next thing we're going to want to do is, since we took the cams out of the head to inspect the bearing surfaces and the cam itself and the little buckets here, it's a good idea to, before you send it off to the machine shop, to go ahead and loosely bolt everything back up. Now, what you would do before you bolt the head back on the motor when you get it back, if the machine shop, say didn't adjust the valve clearance for you, which they should, but I'll show you what you go through here on this particular motor. You want to pull each one of these little buckets out one at a time and look at the underside of it. In here, there should be a number in there. Sometimes they can be a little tough to read, but it's in there. It'll be written right in here inside the bucket in this outside ring. And what that is that's the dimensions from that inside surface right there that actually touches the top of the valve, and then this surface here which rides against the camshaft. So that would be 497 thousandths. Now, what I like to do, just in case, like if I were assembling this head myself, then I would pull each one of these buckets out and record what size bucket is on top of each valve. And then just make yourself up a little sheet like this, and you can write it down as to what the cup size is for each valve on each cylinder. That way, you'll know if you have to make an adjustment, you actually have to get a different sized cup. So the specifications on these heads are 20 thousandths clearance, valve clearance for the intake, and 35 thousandths for the exhaust. So let's just say, to keep it simple, let's say that was 500, okay, which means it would be 500 thousandths of an inch thick. And let's say we had 25 thousandths clearance when we measured the valve clearance on this valve. That's 5 thousandths too much. So we would have to go and get a thicker bucket. So, and we would need like a 505, or a bucket that says 505 in there. And that's how you would actually set the valve clearance. Ideally, you have the machine shop do it for you, because they'll have, all these buckets, a collection of all these buckets in different thicknesses. Now we have to deal with that bolt that broke in the head, and of course we could just let the machine shop deal with it, but of course that's gonna cost him some money. So we'll go ahead and see what we can do about getting it out. It's probably gonna have to get drilled out. Well, that was fun. I ended up having to drill it out, and I always hate it when that happens. You just have to fight these damn things, but we got it out. That's what counts. So. And what I'll do is I'll run a tap down in there and clean those threads up, and soak it real good with some PB Blaster. Now at this point, I believe I'm ready to wrap everything up and get it ready for him to take, oh yeah, I didn't mention that. So the fellow that owns this car, he drives a truck back and forth, or part of his route is to Salt Lake City, Utah. And out that way, it's like everybody drives a Subaru because it's like up in the mountains. He found a machine shop up there that specializes in doing machine work for Subarus. So, I wholeheartedly agreed with him. He drives his truck, semi out there once a week. So what he's going to do is I'm going to call him tomorrow, and then we're going to wrap, package all this stuff up nice and tidy, and he's going to put it in the cab of his truck and take it on with him. So, and place is called Metric Motors, I believe. And I'm like, okay, that sounds like a plan. And then in a couple of weeks, we'll be putting this thing back together and firing it up. So I'll be looking forward to that. Anyhow, that's going to do it for this video. Appreciate y'all watching. And if you like what you see, please subscribe. And it helps me pay for the tools and things to make this shop work. And as I work a day job, this is not my whole entire gig. So, and of course, if you do subscribe, go ahead and click the notification icon if you want to be notified next time I post a video. You can find us offline if you care to at MacGyversWorkshop@gmail.com, or you can hit us up on the website there and see what we're doing at www.MacGyversWorkshop.net. So, again, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.